Hello, today I'm going to go over very briefly the ACT Science section. So, what is the ACT Science section? Well, the ACT Science section is the very last section of the ACT. As you can see here, there's a 4, so it's the very last test out of 4. So if you take your ACT exam, this is going to be the very last thing you're going to see. So the science test is 40 questions, and you have 35 minutes to complete those 40 questions. And these 40 questions are generally split between several passages, and that's generally 6 to 7 passages in one ACT test. And remember, you're not able to use your calculator, but there is very little, if any, math on the test. So generally the passages are about a scientific idea, a scientific topic, and experiments that scientists use in order to get more information about a scientific topic. So usually in passages, you will see graphs like this one, and you can see tables. See, this one is very complicated, but is not very complicated, but things like this one can be a lot more complicated. Now you can also see figures like this, basically saying this is how our scientific experiment is set up. And if you see this, and you also see a graph like this that looks a little complicated, don't worry, right? The big thing, the key to ACT science is that you don't actually have to know very complicated science ideas. The ACT expects you to know a very few basic science ideas, which we will go over in other videos. But for the most part, the ACT science really wants to test you on your ability to read graphs like this, right? So you don't have to know what a reactor is or a condenser is and how they work together. And you don't need to know what alpha is or what this symbol even means. You don't even have to know what dB stands for. All the ACT wants you to tell them is you know the difference between, for example, this completely black line, which we see is 1000 hertz, and this dotted line for 500 hertz, and this line right here, right? Now, there are generally 3 main passage types. So the 6 to 7 passages, they're going to come in 3 main forms: the research practices, data representation, and conflicting viewpoints. So half, a little bit over or under half of your science exam is going to be a type of passage called research practices. And in this, you're going to answer questions about how an experiment was set up and about the experiment in general. So you will see passages like these, where they'll tell you about a scientist that considered different factors or information and then had experiments. See how it was experiment 1, experiment 2, experiment 3, right? And these have the simpler tables as you see here. And these are going to basically be more focused on asking you about the information from the tables for each experiment. So now we have data representation. That's the second type, which is 30 to 40% of the exam. And you're going to be answering questions about the graphs, tables, and figures. Now, research practices also has a lot of graphs and tables and figures, but the difference is if we go back to our research practices, it's going to be specifically about the different experiments and the differences between the tables for them. Data representation is going to be more specifically less about the different experiments and more about the graphs themselves and the tables themselves. See how it's just one specific thing that you're looking at? There's only one figure in one table, unlike the other one that has experiments. But this one, you're going to look at the more complicated data or information. So see how this table is a lot more complicated. And then we have our conflicting viewpoints, which is 15 to 20%. And for this, you're going to compare different views scientists have on an idea. So for here, you have scientist 1 and scientist 2. And this paragraph is describing what scientist 1 thinks about a specific idea. Here it's water levels. And scientist 2, what you think of the same idea, but they're going to have a little bit of a different conclusion, or they're going to think a little bit differently than scientist 1. And the test just wants you to know, do you know the difference between what scientist 1 thinks versus scientist 2 thinks? Now, within those 3 different types of passages, you can see the 3 main question types: interpretation of data, scientific investigation, and the evaluation of models, inferences, and experimental results. The interpretation of data is 40 to 50%, so a little bit under half. And in that, you're going to ask a question, can you directly get information from a chart or a graph? So again, for the 3 main types of passages, this is going to be the very, very basic, can you read the graph questions? So as you can see, according to figure 2, so you know how we looked at specific graphs, you're going to look at whatever graph is figure 2 is, and you're going to see what does that graph say, right? And if you can get this, which is the very basic, can you just tell me at this specific time what this graph says, then you already have half of the ACT science understood. Now you're going to have your scientific investigation questions, 20 to 30%, which asks, can you see how and why experiments are set up? So for these, you have the information, but remember, there can be many different experiments, basically saying, okay, what did they do in experiment 1 versus experiment 2? And what are kind of the different factors that they used in order to see information? So for that, you're going to be asked questions like, how do the designs of 2 experiments differ? How are they different? Or they're going to look at how to study different factors of that experiment. The hardest is going to be the evaluation of models, inferences, and experimental results. Basically, now that you see what the graph looks like and you see how the experiment was set up, how the different factors influence the data, can you make conclusions based on that? So this will usually start with based on the results of, what do you think, right? So for this, it's going to basically make you look at both the data and how the experiment was set up to see basically what the scientists were trying to see from whatever experiment that they are looking at. So that is a very, very quick rundown of the ACT science section. We will go more in depth about all of this in the future.